Howdy, Ty Bricker here. Before we start this one, I just got to say that it is May 15th, and I'm in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, and it's snowing right now. It's snowing out here, and I'm trying not to get discouraged by that because here we live the shining for 6 months out of the year. So I could really use a trip to Moab right now and sunbathing on a rock, I'll tell you, for about 3 days. So it's snowing. I'm dealing with that right now. I hope it's nice wherever you're at. So what are we going to do today? Today we're going to go over a few things that we kind of briefly talked about a few episodes ago. If you remember, we have talked about a few different things. The last one was about NATO, the UN, the League of Nations, global warfare, and how they're completely incapable of doing what their mission statement says that they're supposed to be capable of doing and what they're very, very well funded to do. But before that, at the end of April, we talked about liberty and freedom, tribal self-determination, and some of the origins associated with that. We talked a lot about Thomas Hobbes, some principles that kind of laid some of the foundational work a little bit for the Republic, for the establishment of the American Republic. Today, we're going to focus on probably the most influential human being that influenced the founding fathers and the establishment of this state, and that's John Locke. John Locke is incredibly influential. If you're a constitutionalist, if you're an individual who believes in equal protection under the law, the separation of powers, the rights of private property, rational thought and reason, and you do not know who John Locke is, then you have a blaring hole in your knowledge. I highly recommend investigating this dude. He had outcomes, his ideals and his philosophy had both good and bad outcomes within this republic, and we're going to kind of go over those just a little bit here. We're going to go over how the idea and reality, ideals and reality, philosophy and reality don't always marry up perfectly. Maybe not perfectly. And we'll go into that a little. We'll go into the good and the bad of it, kind of. So who was John Locke? He was born in 1632 in England, and he died in 1704. He was an English philosopher whose works literally laid the foundation for the modern political experiment, which is basically the United States. The founding principles of the American experiment are often attributed to the Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers such as John Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire, or even Hobbes, who was a little bit earlier. At the heart of this intellectual lineage lies the ideal of individual liberty, paired with the promise of equal protection under the law as the foundation for a just and rational society. You can't have a just and rational society, a society based on equal protection under the law, without individual liberty. It's paramount. This vision emerged from a philosophical shift in which mankind, previously roaming aimlessly in the state of nature, who we talked about with Hobbes, we talked about it a few episodes ago, we kind of challenged that a little bit, consented to enter a social contract that would secure his or her natural rights, our naturally born rights. For Locke in particular, liberty was not merely a political construct, but a divine endowment, an inalienable right rooted in the dignity and equity of all people, regardless of skin color, religion, belief structure, competency, all people, an inalienable right. We've heard that before, right? We hear that term inalienable rights all the time. Civil liberties, in this view, were to be protected by the state, not granted from it. Civil liberties were to be protected by the state, not granted from it, because there are inalienable rights. Yet, while the Enlightenment era, which we'll talk more about that timeline, championed liberty, reason, and progress, its implementation often contradicted its ideals. The so-called age of reason became, in practice, an age of conquest. Now, we're going to go back and forth on this a little bit. Enlightenment principles were wielded as a moral justification for domination. Liberty itself was repackaged as a civilizing mission that rationalized the enslavement, removal, and extermination of indigenous peoples in the New World. Now, I know right when you hear that, you think that that's where we're going to go with this throughout this whole thing. That's not true. Don't just turn it off. Okay? There's going to be a lot of good. We're going to identify how philosophy and implementation, thought and reality, the good and bad of that. Under the banner of liberty, European colonizers weaponized the spread of empire. Thus, the Enlightenment project and Locke's place within it must be accessed not only through its transformative ideals, which Locke's ideals were absolutely transformative, just like the Magna Carta, just like John Wycliffe's ideals, they were transformative for the time especially. And it's those kinds of those kind of ideals back in those days would get you killed quick. Okay? But also through the contradictions and exclusions that emerged in their application, just like we talked about before. There is a difference between thinking and reality. There's a difference between philosophy and outcomes. No Slurpee sounds with the coffee. In order to somewhat understand these outcomes, we must address the following question. What was John Locke's view of liberty and freedom? They're not the same thing. And how did that impact the development of democratic institutions, such as the United States and other democratic institutions? At the core of the American Republic lies two foundational ideals. Okay? The liberty of conscience, the liberty of the mind, rationality and reason, and the liberty of the individual. Okay? So the liberty of the individual is a little bit different than the liberty of conscience, because now you're also talking about my physical body and my physical presence as well. Okay? Many of those who first ventured to the New World did so under the banner of Christianity, seeking refuge from religious persecution and the freedom to worship as they chose. Okay, and a lot of that was the split between Catholicism and Protestantism, which we talked about a little bit a few episodes ago as well. I highly recommend going back and looking at that. Through Christian thought, though Christian thought influenced early colonial life, few among the founding fathers were actually formally trained in the clergy. Very few. They were much more philosophers than they were clergy or embedded in the church, interestingly enough. It's important that we keep that in mind when we understand the foundational principles of this republic. It is very important. Indeed, most approached religion through a more philosophical, enlightenment-infused lens. Now, this gets us to deism. What is deism? Now, the founding fathers, none of the founding fathers, there's no writing saying that they were deists, or that even John Locke was a deist. They didn't self-espouse that, but their ideals were extremely deistic. Extremely. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to define what deism is. You'll see it for yourself. Okay, so deism is the belief in the existence of a supreme being, a God, okay? Specifically a creator who does not intervene in the universe. That's the big difference between traditional religion, especially if you think about Christianity, Islam, Judaism, versus what deist thought kind of is, okay? This term is used chiefly as part of the intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th century, so the 16 and 1700s, that accepted the existence of a creator, the existence of a God on the basis of reason. So through our rational thought and reason, we can understand the existence of God, but rejected belief in the supernatural deity who interacts with mankind. Okay? So deists basically believe that God gave us reason, rational thought, independent decision-making, but doesn't intervene necessarily in our existence. It's up to us to figure it out, okay? That's what the deist thought is. So you have free will. Use that free will to think rationally and have reason, okay? What distinguished deists from their Christian counterparts was not the belief in God, as I stated, but belief about God's nature and God's role. While traditional denominations such as Puritan, Baptist, Quakers, Catholics, and others upheld a vision of an active, intervening God or an intervening deity who shaped the world through miracles and divine revelation, deists espoused a very different theology based around free will and rationalism. To them, God was a rational creator who set the universe in motion but no longer interfered in its affairs. Revelation was regarded with skepticism, and in its place, deists elevated reason, rational thought, empirical observation, and natural law as the true source of religious understanding. Empirical observation, reason, and rationality, and natural law. Those were the sources of religious understanding. This worldview profoundly shaped several key architects of the American political order. It is crucial that we understand the role that deism had in the foundational principles of this country, because it had an extraordinarily valuable role. Many whom embrace deism emphasize on moral autonomy and rational inquiry as essential foundations for a free society. The deists thought of moral autonomy, whether it's of the mind and of the body, autonomy, and rational inquiry, our idea to be able to ask questions. So we can act independently and we are able to freely ask questions. Okay, our entire society is built around these concepts. Thomas Jefferson was one of these individuals that was extremely deist-leaning. While examining John Locke's connections to liberty, freedom, and its implementation through the state, it is important to understand its conduit, and his conduit was Thomas Jefferson. John Locke, the American Republic, Thomas Jefferson, right here in the middle. That's the conduit. Thomas Jefferson held John Locke in extremely high regard, viewing him as one of the most important influences on his political philosophy. Jefferson once wrote that Locke, paired with Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton, were among the three, quote, the three greatest men that have ever lived without any exception, end quote. He revered Locke, not only for his scientific method and rational approach, but especially for his political writings. Jefferson drew heavily on Locke's two treaties of government when drafting the Declaration of Independence. Locke's ideals about natural rights, government by consent, and the right to revolution were central to Jefferson's vision of American republicanism. I'll say that again. It's going to sound familiar. Locke's ideas about natural rights, government by consent, and the right to revolution were all central to Jefferson's visions of American republicanism. Obviously, these ideals predated Jefferson through John Locke. Jefferson adapted and transformed Locke's phrase of life, liberty, and property into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For those of you that don't know, everybody kind of has heard of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, Jefferson got that phrase from John Locke through life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and the ability to have property, material possessions. Reflecting both Locke's influence and a more expansive view of human fulfillment when he kind of changed that quote a little bit. Jefferson saw Locke as an intellectual archetype of liberty and used his work as a moral and political foundation for American independence and constitutionalism, which is so inherently American today. Though not a deist in the strictest sense, especially being that he was, in the 18th century, you got to be really, really, deists in the 18th century, you couldn't, be openly deist. You had to be really careful about that kind of stuff. I think that's why there's not, anything written worldview, not our generation's worldview, the founding generation's worldview. Deism, emerging in the 17th and 18th centuries, as we stated, rejected supernatural revelation and miracles in favor of rational, law-bound understanding of the universe. God, according to deist thought, was not an intervening presence, but a divine architect who established natural laws and then allowed the cosmos to operate according to reason on their own, free will. Free will is also big in Christianity. Locke's insistence that natural rights such as life, liberty, and property were discernible through reason rather than scripture placed him in close alignment with deist ideals, for sure, overwhelmingly so, as a matter of fact. While Locke himself believed in Christian revelation, his emphasis on empirical observation and moral reason, or science and reason, laid the groundwork for a belief system that privilege logic over dogma, reason over theology, reason over the church, quite frankly. This rational approach to morality and governance was immensely influential among the American founders. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and others espoused deist-leaning views, overwhelmingly so, seeing in Locke's writing a blueprint for a society grounded in natural rights and secular law. What does secular mean? What is secular law as opposed to like theocratic law? Just basically means to have no religious or spiritual basis. So it's law based on reason. Now, if you think about the United States, it's absolutely built this way through the First Amendment, through the separation of the church and state, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. Us to be able to challenge authority is very secular. Okay, Jefferson in particular admired Locke's theory of a limited government derived from the consent of the governed. A limited government derived from the consent of the government. Sound familiar? And responsible for the protection of inherent liberties and rights. All right. The Declaration of Independence, invocation of nature's God and inalienable rights, nature's God and inalienable rights, reflects this union of Enlightenment deism and Lockean natural law theory. The founders believed that liberty was not granted by monarchs or the clergy, by kings or the church, or by kings or priests, but was an inherent condition of man's rational nature, to be protected by just laws and limited institutions or government. Okay, I'll say that again. The founders believed that liberty was not granted by monarchs or the clergy, but was an inherent conditions of man's rational, inalienable nature, the rights that you were born with, that not the state gives you, but you were born with, to be protected by just laws and limited institutions government. We'll get into what that means a little bit here too. Moreover, the deist embrace of rationalism as the highest moral faculty corresponded directly with Locke's own method of deriving political legitimacy from reason. Everything about these ideas stems from reason and rationality. In 1689, Locke wrote a letter concerning toleration. Locke argued that religious belief should never be coerced by the state. Locke argued that religious belief should never be coerced by the state. Sound familiar? First Amendment. A position that resonated strongly with deist calls for religious freedom and the separation of the church and the state, the First Amendment. These principles would become institutionalized in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, guaranteeing freedom of conscience and preventing the establishment of an overarching religion. We are not a society built around a theocracy. We're not a society built around religion. There is a clear separation that is supposed to take place. The founders said you can practice any religion you want freely without fear of persecution because they experienced that persecution firsthand. That's why the separation of church and state was so fundamental towards deist thought and belief. Locke's philosophical legacy, infused with deist rationalism, helped shape the republic that sought to harmonize freedom with moral order, liberty with law, and reason with political authority. Okay, I'll say that again. Locke's philosophical legacy, his writings, infused with deist rationalism, Locke's ideals, infused with deist ideals, helped shape a republic that sought to harmonize freedom with moral order, liberty with law, and reason with political authority. Regarding the work of John Locke himself, his most notable work was written in 1689, which is the Two Treatises of Government, remains one of the most foundational texts of liberal political theory here and internationally. And it is within this work that Locke articulates a nuanced version of freedom rooted in the concepts of natural and political liberty. Natural liberty, as Locke defines it, refers to the inherent right of individuals to live free from subjugation or the will and authority of others. Natural liberty, under Locke, refers to the inherent right of the individual to live free from subjugation of the authority of others, individual rights and autonomy. This liberty is not lawless, but is governed by natural law, a moral code discernible through reason, which obliges individuals to respect the life, liberty, and property of others if you want your life, your liberty, and your property to be respected. Okay? In Locke's state of nature, human beings are born equal and free, bound only by reason and conscience. Okay? Political liberty, in contrast, arises when individuals willingly exit the state of nature and consent to form a political society. Okay? This transition does not require the surrender of freedom, okay? But it is reconfigured. Freedom is changed into liberty. That's why freedom and liberty is different. We talked about this before. You have absolute freedom as a berserker in the hills of Scandinavia, as a mountain man in the Rocky Mountains in the 17th and 18th century, 18th and 19th century. You have liberty living in a free state under law. Okay. Let me see where I'm at. This transition does not require the surrender of freedom, but its reconfiguration, as I said, into the legal framework designed to protect it. Freedom is transformed into liberty when we have a legal framework designed to protect it. For Locke, liberty is never the absence of restraint. Rather, it is a condition of living under just laws that are established by mutual agreement and apply equally to all. This is how application changes a little bit from outcomes are a little bit different than ideas, okay? Because obviously during this time, when Locke is talking, and during the Founding Fathers and after, the law does not apply equally at all, even though that is how it was written. It obviously does not apply equally to all. It did not apply to African-American slaves. It did not apply a lot to the Chinese that came over, helped build the railroad. Obviously, the Native Americans, even the Irish. There was a lot of cultures, there was a lot of peoples, a lot of societies that they did not have equal protection under the law in actual application. However, Locke's conception of the state of nature is central to his political philosophy and a defining feature that distinguishes his work from that of earlier thinkers like Hobbes. Now, we talked about Hobbes a little bit before. Locke takes Hobbes to account a little bit on man in his natural state. For Hobbes, man in his natural state is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Everybody's against everybody. It's a free-for-all. Of course, when he was doing that writing, as we previously discussed, his ability to access primary sources for how men actually were in their natural state, pre-existing Egypt or Samaria or any of those other, or even the Old Testament, where man is not in a natural state. Man at that point in time in any of those, in Egypt or Samaria or in the Old Testament, is still living under some kind of authority in a lot of ways. So Locke kind of takes Hobbes to task there. It changes a little bit. For Locke, this primordial condition is not a chaotic free-for-all, as we talked about, but a realm of perfect freedom and moral equity, where individuals are governed by natural law rather than an authoritarian authority. Natural law in Locke's framework is not divine command in the theological sense, but a rational principle. So it's not a command in the sense that the church would make it, but a rational individual principle based on reason and free will. An unwritten moral code discoverable through reason that teaches individuals to respect one another's rights. To respect one another's rights through reason and rationality. Again, life, liberty, and property. In this state, all people are free and equal, but that freedom is fragile, often insecure in the absence of a neutral and enforceable authority to adjudicate disputes and protect rights, hence the state. That's when the state comes in, okay? It is this instability, not an inherent tendency towards violence, as Hobbes would say, that leads rational individuals to voluntarily leave the state of nature and form civil societies. We do that not because of the violence we experience in the state of nature, but because we want to have our property and rights protected against invading forces, against other individuals, things like that. Through collective consent, they establish governments, not to dominate authoritarian-wise, but to secure these rights that are already theirs via nature, okay? This inversion of the traditional view of political power where the individual precedes the state, this inversion of the traditional view of political power, where the individual comes before the state, radically reframes the purpose of governance itself. The state exists exclusively, solely to serve the people. And when it ceases to do so, it forfeits its legitimacy. In this context, Locke explicitly asserts the right of the people to resist or even overthrow a government that becomes tyrannical. I'm going to say all that again because it sounds very American, right? Very American. The state exists only to serve the people, and when it ceases to do so, it forfeits its legitimacy. In this context, Locke explicitly asserts the right of the people to resist or even overthrow a government that becomes tyrannical. That is absolutely a very, very American concept. John Locke was the first to write about that. An argument that profoundly shaped the ideology of later revolutionary movements, including the American Revolution and others, even the Irish and others. Unlike Thomas Hobbes, who portrayed the state of nature as a violent, brutish state requiring absolute sovereignty, monarchy, in Hobbes' view, Hobbes preferred monarchy over anything else to maintain peace. Locke's vision insists that liberty and government are not mutually exclusive. Instead, liberty is only fully realized when individuals are protected by laws they have a role in shaping. Okay? Instead, liberty is only fully realized when individuals are protected by laws they have a role in shaping. A government of laws, not of men. Again, very American. When you read John Locke, all that stuff that Thomas Jefferson and all the founders threw in there into the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, very Lockean, almost to the point of being plagiaristic, to tell you the truth. While John Locke is most commonly situated with the intellectual current of the Enlightenment, the philosophical foundations of his thought are deeply embedded originally in the Renaissance revival of humanism. Okay, so what's the difference between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment? This is important to understand. So we'll briefly go into what the Renaissance is, which led to the Enlightenment, and some of the philosophers you'll notice come from them. The Renaissance was a period of European history from basically the 14th to the 17th century, so the 1300s to the 1600s, marked by a revival of classical learning and art, a shift in focus towards humanism, as I said, or humanity, and advancements in science and philosophy. It was a time of intellectual kind of rebirth following the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were so dicked up that it led to the Renaissance, which eventually led to the Enlightenment, because people were desperate to get away from the power of kings and the church, because kings and the church were screwing up, were just decimating societies. Some of the more prominent thinkers of the Renaissance are Machiavelli, who I'm sure you've probably heard of, Sir Francis Bacon, who Thomas Jefferson also really, really admired. You have Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, you have Descartes, you have Galileo Galilei, all right, who was extremely, obviously vital, and Thomas Hobbes. Those guys are all Renaissance era thinkers, okay? Now, if you think about the Enlightenment, which kind of came right after the Renaissance, the Enlightenment was an 18th century or 1700s-ish, which also comes at, like, the establishment of the United States comes right at the tail end of it, and the writings of John Locke before that. Intellectual and cultural movement that emphasized reason, individual liberty, and the pursuit of knowledge. Reason, individual liberty, and the pursuit of knowledge, stuff we still hold in high regard today. It was characterized by a focus on empirical observation, scientific inquiry, challenging traditional religious and political authority in favor of rational thought and human progress. That's the Enlightenment. Individuals within the Enlightenment, prominent, obviously John Locke, Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, Voltaire. These are all individuals you can read and understand that they're extraordinarily influential. And before that, you kind of had, so even predating the Renaissance, you had the Magna Carta, which was kind of the first pen-to-paper document establishing some form of liberty. That was in 1215. It was signed by King John of England. We did speak about this briefly a few episodes ago. And also, John Wycliffe, who was probably really the first Protestant, he was the first person to translate the Bible into English and believed that humans should be able to individually read the Bible and interpret it on their own through individual thought, reason, and rationality, rather than it being in Latin and him having no idea what it says and being forced to only have a priest be the sole arbiter of religious thought and ideals and implementation. John Wycliffe was at serious odds with that. And like we said before in the previous one, the church felt so highly of him for daring to translate the Bible into English and thinking that people should have their own Bibles and be able to read and come up with their own conclusions, that after he died, they dug him up, tore his body apart, and threw all of his bones into a river. Okay. That's very Middle Ages. Okay. So we talked about Renaissance, revival of humanism, which emphasized the dignity, agency, and rational potential of the individual. This is kind of when the individual finally starts to get individualized, right? To where it matters what the individual is experiencing. The Renaissance, beginning in the 14th century Italy, reorientated European intellectual life away from purely theological ideals, again, ideals strictly based on church and religious thought, towards a rediscovery of classical ideals, especially the ethical and civic writings of ancient Greek and Roman thinkers. They kind of reinvestigated a lot of these individuals, such as Cicero and some of these other guys, that, be like, what did they say? We need to understand what some more of these thinkers thought and try to understand it, where before they weren't really allowed to. At its heart was the concept of humantis, or humanism, the belief that human beings possess the capacity for reason, virtue, and moral autonomy, and therefore had an active role to play in shaping the political and cultural world. This was a revolutionary ideal. It doesn't seem very revolutionary now when you look at TikTok and we live our life in 30-second intervals like a goldfish. But back in those days, the foundational principles here, this is kind of where it starts. And it was dangerous, very, very dangerous to be one of these people that had these beliefs. Renaissance humanists championed education, civic engagement, and a growing skepticism towards absolute authority, whether it be the church or a monarchy. Whether it stemmed from monarchy or the church, as I said, these values would be echoed and transfigured in Locke's political philosophy, where the rational individual became the moral and intellectual cornerstone of the modern state. I will say that again. It's important. This is based on education, individual autonomy. Why did John Wycliffe believe it was so important to have the Bible have an English translation? Because he believed in the idea of the individual, of individual thought and reason. These values would be echoed and transfigured in Locke's political philosophy, where the rational individual became the moral and intellectual cornerstone of the modern state. The rational individual, rational reason, became the moral and intellectual cornerstone of the modern state that we're living in today. Locke's contribution was to reframe these Renaissance ideals within the emerging Enlightenment emphasis on imperial inquiry, natural rights, and secular government. Once again, secular, away from religious law. We don't see it so much today because we've had the separation of church and state for so long in our society that we don't understand the true dangers of theocratic rule. We see it through Sharia law. When people talk about Islam in the Middle East, the last time that we really saw it in Europe or even in the Americas was really the Middle Ages, or even the establishment of the state originally in the Americas. And we've drifted pretty far away from that. So individually, we have a really hard time understanding how dangerous theocratic rule really is and how important a secular government is, that takes into account everybody's ideals, reason, and thought to promote all of us, not just a very particular group of us or a very particular group of clergy, for example. For Locke, the legitimacy of political power did not derive from divine right or religious orthodoxy, but instead from reasoned consent and mutual obligation. Reasoned consent, rational consent, thoughtful consent, educated consent, and mutual obligation towards each other. In place of a hierarchical, theologically justified rule, a rule based on monarchy in the church, Locke proposed a system in which individuals, by virtue of their rationality, were the ultimate source of political authority. So instead of the church, instead of the monarchy or the king, Locke proposed a system in which individuals, us lowly peasants, by virtue of our reason and rationality and intelligence, were the ultimate source of political authority. This was revolutionary. The law, in his view, should not reflect the arbitrary will of rulers or priests, or kings or priests, but should instead be grounded in the natural rights of individuals and constructed through processes that respect and understand their consent. I'll say that again. Okay? The law, which is all-powerful, should not reflect the arbitrary will of priests or kings. The law should not be in place just to help out priests or kings. This was written out in the Magna Carta as well. But should instead be grounded in the natural rights of individuals and constructed through processes that respect and understand the consent of the peasantry. Okay? In this way, Locke bridged the Renaissance celebration of human potential with the Enlightenment commitment to liberty and secularism, forging a vision of politics that continues to underpin democratic thought and institutions today. I'll say that again. Locke combined the Renaissance celebration of humanism and human potential with the Enlightenment commitment to liberty and secularism, away from the church, rule away from the clergy, rule away from kings, forging a vision of politics that continues to underpin democratic thought and institutions to this day. Moreover, Locke's political philosophy aligned perfectly with the central values of the Enlightenment, which were reason and a deep skepticism of inherited authority. Okay, reason, a deep skepticism towards inherited authority, and the belief in the ideals of the individual. This also made his ideals especially appealing to democratic reformers across Europe and the Atlantic world, as I said. In contrast to the theocratic rule and the rigid doctrinal authority of earlier centuries between kingships and the church, Locke insisted that knowledge should arise from empirical observation and critical reflection rather than unquestioned tradition and rigid compliance. So if you think about unquestioned tradition and rigid compliance, that sounds very Middle Ages, right? You're not allowed to question. You're not allowed to know. You're not allowed to be educated. You're not allowed to be able to read. You must comply rigidly, or else we will burn you to death. Okay? We were moving hard away from that. And that framework is evident. This stance translated directly into political theory. Just as beliefs must be tested by reason and experience, so too should governments be subjected to rational criticism and public accountability. That is the First Amendment. That is why the First Amendment is so damn important, and why I hear people on the right even now talking about censorship for a certain state in the Middle East that we're not allowed to talk about anymore because they don't want us to talk about. How is that any different than censoring COVID or the Hunter Biden laptop story or anything else? Censorship is censorship regardless, okay? Just as beliefs must be tested by reason and experience, so too should governments be subjected to rational criticism and public accountability. That is the First Amendment. That is why the freedom of speech, assembly, separation of church and state is so vitally important to our republic. If we eliminate that for the benefit of anything, regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with it, you reject rational criticism and public accountability of our government officials. You reject that. It was this vision that political power constrained by logic, law, and mutual consent that became the cornerstone of Enlightenment liberalism. This became the cornerstone of Enlightenment liberalism. Now, here's another thing. Liberalism. When we talk about liberalism, most people today, if I say, hey, you're a liberal, you're just going to assume that this person is either a Democrat or a progressive, somebody on the left, Green Party, whatever. And if you're a constitutionalist, if you're a conservative, you're on the right. Well, what is the original definition of the term liberalism? Because John Locke was a liberal. Thomas Jefferson was liberal. All of the founding fathers were extremely liberal. Extremely liberal. What does that mean? Liberalism, originally, is a political philosophy emphasizing individual rights, liberty, and the consent of the governed. I'll say that again. Liberalism is a political philosophy emphasizing individual rights, liberty, and the consent of the governed. Sounds pretty constitutionalist to me these days, doesn't it? It generally supports private property, market economies, and a range of civil and political freedoms. Key tenets within liberalism include the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and the rule of law. That's what liberalism is in the original sense of the word. We have dramatically redefined what liberalism actually means. Okay. In 1689, Locke's letter concerning toleration offers one of the earliest and most forceful arguments for religious liberty, contending that the state has no legitimate role in compelling belief or interfering in the private conscience of individuals. Again, the First Amendment. John Locke is all over the First Amendment. If you read the First Amendment, every single word should have John Locke's name in between the words. Okay? This principle, alongside his advocacy for limited government and the separation of powers, right? Just like we have here, the three branches of government, helped lay the theoretical groundwork for modern societies based around pluralism and pluralistic lines. Okay, pluralism, a condition of a system in which two or more states, groups, principles, sources of authority can exist. Just like the separation of powers. Okay, we don't have a king, we have a separation of powers. There's three separate equal branches of government. In Locke's view, liberty did not mean the absence of regulation, but rather the presence of a moral and legal framework in which individuals could exercise their reason freely, pursue their own good, and live without fear of an unpredictable power, such as a church or a king. His ideal of liberty as rational self-governance resonated profoundly with Enlightenment efforts to construct societies composed of educated, morally autonomous citizens. Individuals capable of both resisting tyranny and upholding civic responsibility. Individuals, a society built around individuals who are both capable of resisting tyranny and upholding civil responsibility. For you to resist tyranny and uphold civil responsibility, you have to be educated on what that even means. That's rationality, that's reason. That's what this whole thing is built on. Locke thus helped to define the moral character of modern democracy. Not merely a system of institutions, but a culture of reasoned freedom. That's what liberty is. Liberty is reasoned freedom. All right. The founding fathers of the United States did not merely admire John Locke. They read him extensively, debated his principles, and adapted his ideals directly into the architecture of their new republic, especially within the very first enshrined right, which is the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the separation of church and state. This was our first defined right. All right. Nowhere is this clearer than in Thomas Jefferson's famous phrasing in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which echoes Locke's formulation of, like we said, of life, liberty, and property. While Jefferson's adaptation signaled a shift from purely economic conceptions of rights towards a broader version of human flourishing, see, this is where it separates a little bit. Well, the reason that Jefferson got away from property so much into the pursuit of happiness was a shift towards a broader vision of human flourishing and rights that wasn't just built around property and materialism. The underlying Lockean principle remained. Rights are not granted by governments, but are inherent to all individuals by virtue of nature and their humanity, are inalienable born rights. Okay? Locke's argument that legitimate political authority arises only through the consent of the governed, provided the philosophical foundation for both the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. His theory of the social contract, that individuals voluntarily surrender their certain freedoms in exchange for protection of their remaining rights, became a central justification for representational government, the separation of powers, and limited executive power. Limited executive power to make sure we didn't have a king, right? These principles are echoed throughout the Federalist Papers, where James Madison and Alexander Hamilton invoked the necessity of checks and balances to do what? To prevent tyranny. Everything about this is about preventing tyranny and ensuring that the individual, the peasant, has rights and equal protection under the law. A mechanism directly traceable to Locke's distrust of concentrated authority. In Federalist Number 51, Madison's famous pronouncement that ambition must be made to counteract ambition aligns with Locke's insistence that political liberty requires the division or separation of powers across institutions. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. That's human nature. That's what he's talking about. Human nature, humanity, the individual, in a lot of ways, certain people are going to try to get as much power, influence, property, and material possessions and money as possible. We must do the best we can to install institutions that prevent that too much. Today, that's a whole nother investigation on where we're at with politicians today, with insider trading and the way that, anyway, it's a completely different thing we'll get into later. Locke's influence extended far beyond the American context, as we said. His writings on religious tolerance, property rights, and constitutional government informed institutional reforms in England during the Glorious Revolution and later shaped democratic theory all throughout Europe. His ideals found renewed expression in France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which was in 1789, which emphasized liberty, legal equality, and the sovereignty of the people, tenets that Locke had championed nearly a century before that time. And then they instituted his policies or his beliefs. In this sense, Locke must be understood not just as a British philosopher, but as an architect or a builder of liberal democracy whose work transcended national boundaries and laid the theoretical groundwork for modern constitutionalism in the West and all across the globe that we see a lot of today. Coffee. Just spilled a little bit of that on myself. Not embarrassed. All right, John Locke's influence on modern political thought is undeniable, but scholarly interpretations of his legacy remain complex and often contentious. As we said kind of in the beginning of this paper, there is a difference between ideas, ideals, and application and outcomes. Political theorist Leo Strauss famously argued that Locke represented a decisive break from the classical tradition of virtue, ethics, initiating a shift towards a more secular and individualistic understanding of natural law. We talked about that, what secular means. In Strauss's reading, Locke transformed natural rights from being grounded in a theological account of human flourishing, which is more of a religious account of human flourishing, into a framework centered around individual self-interest, particularly the right to acquire private property or materialism, or what private property even means, which is whether or not property can be used kind of for financial gain and benefit. According to Strauss, this paved the way for the liberal prioritization of material gain over civic virtue. Material gain over civic virtue. Again, we can kind of see that today with a lot of our politicians and how powerful they get. They're like little kings in their little districts. You know, a development he saw as both a historically significant and morally problematic. Absolutely was. It has been for hundreds of years in different kinds of ways. In contrast, scholars such as Jeremy Waldron have defended Locke's moral and egalitarian commitments, emphasizing his belief in the fundamental dignity and equality of all individuals. Waldron rejects the reduction of Locke's thought to economic liberalism, in other words, what benefits the individual economically, highlighting instead his concern with protecting the poor, advocating for universal rights, and defending freedom of conscience. Similarly, individuals such as John Donne and James Tolley, academics, have argued that Locke's writings are best understood as a serious effort to ground political authority in consent and to protect individual liberty within a framework of mutual obligation, something, again, Locke talked about a lot. These scholars place Locke within the broader context of 17th century, 1600s English politics, underscoring his genuine commitment to constitutional limits and civic freedom or civil freedom. However, Locke's legacy is also not without contradiction. Barbara Arnell, among others, and a lot of others, honestly, has critically examined Locke's writings on property and empire. noting that his second treatise of government contains justifications for colonial expansion and the dispossession, of indigenous peoples, as stated within the introduction of what we were talking about here, by definition of what property actually means. For Arnell, Locke's theory of property, especially the idea that land becomes owned through labor, and labor basically only, was used to rationalize the seizure of territories or land deemed underutilized or a waste, thus linking liberal property theory or land ownership to imperial conquest. This tension between Locke's professed ideals and their use in colonial policy reveals a broader challenge to interpreting his legacy, a gap between principle, like I said, academic theory, and application, which is reality. All right. Now, the interesting thing about that is we don't really have, we have a very, very limited understanding of what the Americas were like prior to like the Indian Wars or the westward expansion. We're coming to find out through LIDAR and through things such as the footprints that were just discovered in White Sands National Park that date back to like 23,000 years ago, that the Americas before disease arrived, kind of with Columbus, around the 15th century, were populated with millions and millions of people. The Americas, especially South America, through LIDAR and the Amazon, we're finding giant, massive, huge, gigantic cities that were just absolutely ravaged and wrecked through disease when the Europeans came over. And even within North America, Hopi tradition, it's interesting. There's a lot of real ancient tradition out there that speak to a completely different heritage, land heritage of Native Americans, especially within the earthworks and the earth mounds that are all along the Mississippi and in Florida. It was extremely populated here. We have a very big misconception of how land was actually being used and utilized in the Americas for tens of thousands of years, unknown amount of time, prior to postmodern kind of or modern European colonialism and involvement into the Americas coming over. And so, you know, when we saw through the westward expansion, we saw the skeletal remains of what was once a gigantic civilization across the Americas that had been decimated for centuries through disease. And so we understand that today. They obviously didn't understand that back then, for sure. Definitely not during the establishment of the Republic. This tension between Locke's professed ideals, I think we already said that, and the difference between application and reality, like I said, are two completely different things. You could say the same thing with Marxism. You could say the same thing through Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations and capitalism. There is a difference between application and reality, or between theory and reality and application and outcomes. Those things are not always the same. Ultimately, Locke's place in the history of political thought requires a careful assessment of both his normative philosophy and the historical use to which it has been implemented. His commitment to liberty, consent, and civil rights continues to inspire defenders of democratic government and institutions to this day. Yet, as critics rightfully point out, the selective application of these ideals, especially in the context of race, empire, and exclusion, demands a critical engagement with the full scope of Locke's influence. It is within this domain that Locke remains most relevant, as both a champion of political liberty and a case study in the limitations of Enlightenment liberalism. He is both of those things, and both are important. John Locke redefined liberty and freedom in a manner that remains foundational to the structure and aspirations of modern democratic societies, governments, and institutions. His articulation of natural rights, the social contract, and government by consent of the governed provided an enduring blueprint for constitutional government and individual autonomy that we still draw upon today. Drawing upon the Renaissance emphasis on human dignity, and the Enlightenment spotlight of reason and rationality and informed thought, Locke transformed abstract ideals into a coherent political philosophy that continues to underpin liberal governments and institutions across the globe and is ever expanding. His vision of liberty as rational self-governance under law, derived from the people's consent, right? Equal protection of the law through the consent of the people, became the moral vocabulary of revolutionaries constitution makers and reformers alike. And yet, this same framework, so critical to expanding rights within European contexts, simultaneously enabled the justification of thievery, conquest, and enslavement of other kinds of peoples, from Tanzania all the way to the Americas. Locke's theory of property, grounded in labor and improvement, rendered indigenous humans ineligible, based on what our understanding or their understanding was at the time, within the logic of liberal land or property ownership. Lands that had sustained native peoples, Native Americans, for tens of thousands of years were declared a waste, ripe for the cultivation and rightful reappropriation. Thus, liberty for the settler was often premised on the depossession or the taking away of the native. All right. In this paradox lies the enduring challenge of Locke's legacy. This is the challenge of his legacy. His writings helped to liberate millions through the promotion of constitutional governments, while they also played a role in the legal and moral rationalization of colonialism and displacement, in turn possibly costing the lives of millions, or at least hundreds of thousands. So it kind of equals out in a way. Understanding Locke's contribution to democratic theory requires holding these contradictions in view. He was both a visionary advocate for human rights through liberty and a philosopher whose ideals were weaponized to justify conquest by some very evil people, for sure. The durability of Locke's influence lies not just in his triumphs, but in the tension between his ideals and their actual application, the ideals and the actual application of those ideals. As we continue to evaluate the foundations of liberty and freedom today, Locke's work remains essential, if complex. Touchstone in the ongoing struggle to reconcile universal principles with historical realities. We are still struggling to reconcile universal principles with historical realities. Very complex, very influential, very meaningful, and absolutely worth exploring. Have a good one. It's not snowing anymore.